somewhat apocryphal story where Mary is at home there in Nazareth, and Joseph comes home from work, and he begins to say hello to Mary, gives her a kiss on the cheek, and begins to inquire about what she's been doing, and she quickly informs him that she's still doing it. She has been busy taking care of the home, cleaning and cooking and getting everything ready while Joseph has been off at work. And Joseph says, okay. He says, well, where is Jesus? Where is Jesus? And she says, oh, I don't know. He's off doing what he usually does. You know, he loves to study the Word of God. You know, he's out. I don't even know where Jesus is right at this very moment, Joseph. And Joseph says, okay now, Mary. I think Jesus, he needs his time. He needs to do all of that. Mary, don't you know who he is? I think he's going to be a big deal one day. Mary, don't you know? Isn't that what Grace just sang? And Mary, there in the first century kitchen, she takes her whatever's in her hand, she slams it down. She's not trying to break it, but she's trying to get his attention. And she says this, Joseph, yes, I do know who he is. Do you? Do you know who Jesus is? And she begins to say to Joseph in the words of Isaiah, our son Jesus, who came by my womb, is Emmanuel, God with us. He is a son that was given to me and to you, but he is a son that is given to the world. He is the light of the world. He will be wondrous in his miracles. He will be mighty in his power. Jesus will do things that we cannot even imagine. Because, folks, it turns out that, yes, Mary knew. She did know. Because she's been reading. And she's been keeping up. The question for Joseph is, do you know? The question for us is, do we know? Do we know? The title of the message is The Birth of Jesus as Light in the World. The birth of Jesus as light in a morally confused world. Think on the days in which Isaiah prophesied the political intrigue, the betrayal of trust between brothers, the going behind people's back. And it's in this context that Isaiah begins to prophesy both to King Ahaz and to the entire nation that God was bringing about a series of events that would result in their hope and their salvation. Though it would be tough, though there would be warfare and there would be violence, God would deliver up unto them a king who would rule with justice and integrity, who would not only defeat the enemies of Israel, but would defeat the wickedness within Israel. And so here this morning, as Isaiah is prophesying from his perspective, God was speaking about the days in which he lived. But I think even Isaiah understood that the sign that would be given, the child that would be born, possibly would be far into the future, or it could be within his lifetime. Now we know from our perspective that it was sometime after Isaiah died, after Isaiah exits the stage, that Jesus comes into the stage of history. But even with those realities, we understand that these verses are applied to Jesus. So what Isaiah says about that messianic figure, we certainly should apply to Jesus. So what does he say about this person that will come? What does he say about this king, this future king who will arise after being born, after being given to humankind. Well, Isaiah envisions three things about this coming king. So with what time we have left, we are going to walk through this and try to discern and understand and apply it to our understanding of not just Jesus, but the nature of this season, the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus. What does it signify, and what does it mean? Do we understand? Do we know who Jesus is? Do we know who he is going to become? Well, number one, this morning, we understand that this coming king, this messianic figure, is going to be a child who brings the light into the world. Look again at verse 2. The people walking in darkness. And oh boy, did the people in Isaiah's day walk in darkness. They walked in the darkness of idolatry. The people in Isaiah's day, they tried to worship the one true God, the God who had delivered them up and installed them into the land. They tried to worship him alongside all of the other gods and goddesses of the nations that surrounded them. If you just take a glance through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, you read about how God over and over was trying to get the attention of the people. But you also read about other gods, gods like the Baal in 1st and 2nd Kings, and the Asherah pole, and so on and so forth. The people were trying to live in that idolatrous way of living, and it was spiritual darkness. They were also living in the shadow, the darkness of fear about the future. They knew that knocking on their doors were the nations of Assyria and Babylon, and they knew the day was coming when they were going to have to fight for their very survival. And they feared that. They feared that the other nations would come in and would literally wipe them off the face of the map. But the truth is, the people walked in perhaps the worst of spiritual darknesses, and that is the alienation that sin brings from God. The God who wanted to be their God. The God who wanted to know them and could be known personally was not known, was not walked with, was not believed. And folks, just like in Isaiah's day, we also have spiritual darkness in the world that we live in today. This week we have been praying for our missionaries all over this globe. And while there are great stories of churches being planted, the gospel going into places where it's never gone before, literally the Great Commission is being fulfilled through the work of missionaries and of Southern Baptists just like you and me. But the truth is, they go out in the midst of some very tough places. They go out in the midst of spiritual darkness. And folks, if we get serious about witnessing for Jesus, one of the things that we are going to find is that there is spiritual darkness in this world. There are people who are so far in, it seems impossible to bring them out. But you know what? Here recently I've been reminded that even in people who I might tend to agree with when it comes to morals, when it comes to maybe political affiliation, perhaps the political issues that I think are important, and that there might be someone that I meet or comes knocking on my door who might be inclined to agree with me perhaps on the sanctity of human life. Even when there is that connection and it seems like there is that light in another, we must admit that if that same person denies the biblical gospel, if they deny salvation by faith alone in Jesus alone, folks, there is a darkness at work even in that individual. We need to be aware of it. We need to understand it. We need to understand that Jesus is that light. One of the ways that darkness works in the life of a person is to bring in the degradation of grief, the darkness of despair, the darkness of hopelessness. That was also at work in Isaiah's day. Folks, I'm sad to say it is at work in our day today. You see, they didn't have Twitter in Isaiah's day. They didn't have Fox News, but they knew. They knew the days ahead were going to be tough. The difference is people know instinctively that the days ahead are going to be tough. They know it because of what they are experiencing. They know it because of what they see. And now we have all those things to remind us on a daily, almost hourly basis about how bad things are. You see, in the Bible, light is a metaphor that dawns in places that are dark. When you apply it spiritually, for example, in the book of Proverbs, light is the light of wisdom in the midst of sinful foolishness. Sometimes light is the metaphor for morality, the moral light in the midst of wickedness and sinfulness. And certainly that is what is implied here in Isaiah. But did you catch what he says? He says in verse 3 that this light that dawns amongst the people is the light of joy. It is the light of hope. He says that the nation will be increased and the battle, did you catch this? The battle will be won. Look again at verses 3 and following. You have enlarged the nation and increased its joy. The people, they rejoice as at harvest time. Let me tell you something. In Isaiah's day, the people were not rejoicing. They were not looking forward to the future, and yet there is a light that is coming in this child who would be born. In verse 4, the oppression has been broken. The rod has been destroyed. Did you catch that allusion to the story of none other than Gideon and his victory over the Midianites? The implication here is that just in the midst of that hopelessness against a people with an army that's bigger than ours and a battle that doesn't seem like it could be won, God raises up His servant Gideon, who leads them to victory over the enemy. Isaiah is saying is that there is coming a day, there is coming a child who will bring the joy, the light of joy and of justice. He is saying He is coming to light things up, and He is coming to make things right. Jesus is this light. He is this person who will come and dawn on humanity. The birth of Jesus is the dawn of God's great and gracious reversal of spiritual fortunes. I think Jesus understood this of Himself. In John 8, verse 12, He says to those that are there, I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This morning, you'll notice that the hard workers of the decorating committee have got us some Christmas lights with the nativity here this morning. It's a reminder that Christmas in many ways is a festival of lights. If you go to my house right now, I've got a humble string of Christmas lights strung on the front of my house, and many others have as well. Here this morning we are reminded that as many people celebrate light on their houses and in their decorations, in their heart of hearts, there is a darkness that needs to be reversed. There is a joy that needs to be restored. And there is a wrong that needs to be righted. Ladies and gentlemen, my brothers and sisters, the birth of Jesus is such a significance that we can understand that whatever darkness plagues us, whatever wrong wrongs us, it can be righted and it can be reversed. But secondly, this king who will come will be a son who reigns for us. I'm, of course, drawing on verse 6. A child will be born for us. A son will be given to us. Don't make any mistake here this morning that verse 6 is key not only to this passage but to this section of Isaiah. Back in chapter 7, Isaiah first announced that a virgin would conceive and bear a son, and his name would be, do you remember? Emmanuel. Isaiah prophesied that, and of course Matthew quotes that. But before Matthew even quotes that, Isaiah explains what Emmanuel means. And it means God with us, right? Yes, but it's not just God with us. Emmanuel also means God for us. It also can mean God in us. Don't miss this, folks. Even Isaiah understood that this coming king would be more than just a political ruler. He would be more than just a religious preacher. He would be someone that God gave. And as it turns out, it is a child. It is his son who is given to humanity. And he is given, did you catch that? To us. He's given to us. Now, Isaiah could not conceive of Christmas morning the way that we can. But perhaps growing up, and maybe still today, on Christmas morning, there will be a little package with your name on it meant for you to open. And maybe you have figured it out. I haven't figured out how to be surprised anymore because I pretty much know when I open that gift that's been given to me, I pretty much know what it is already. But maybe you have not. Maybe you've figured out how to still be surprised. And you're surprised that, oh, you got this year for Christmas. Well, folks, whether you're surprised or not, whether it's Christmas morning, Easter morning, or just some other day of the year, I hope each and every one of us can tell our story. And in our story, in a spiritual sense, there is a Christmas morning where we took a package and it said from God to us, and we opened it up, and whether we were surprised or not, it was Jesus, and we received it by faith. Because even in Isaiah chapter 9, he is talking about the gift of a person that God gives who will be a king. That's what the phrase there, the government will be or will rest on his shoulders. If you could paraphrase it, literally means that he will shoulder the responsibility of reigning. This gift of a son, he shoulders the responsibility and the authority to reign as king. This is a further definition of the concept of Emmanuel. I think I've talked about this before, but this year, unlike years past, I have really been wrestling with the question, why? Why Matthew and Luke, why did they get to tell the birth story of Jesus? You read the four Gospels, and on Wednesday nights we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. Mark, he doesn't mention it. He doesn't say anything about Bethlehem. He doesn't say anything about the shepherds. Nothing. Nothing. He just dives right in. Well, we figured out that's the way Mark is. Frankie, you'd love Mark. He gets right to the point. He cuts to the chase. He gets to the bottom line. That's the way Mark. Matthew and Luke, not so much. Luke especially, he loves detail. He loves so much detail. He just heaps on verse after verse of detail. But none of those, I think, are satisfy an answer to the question of why even consider the birth narratives. Now I get it. We love Christmas time. I mean, we love Christmas time, and I think the temptation is to love Christmas time even if it wasn't about Jesus. You know, it's a special time of the year. We pull out special things just once a year. There's certain songs we listen to once a year. And folks, that's a temptation. Because I think one of the reasons that God, through the inspiration of His Holy Spirit, inspired both Matthew and Luke to tell us about the birth of Jesus was in order that if we ever celebrated the birth of Jesus, we'd have the facts right, and we would have at the very center the truth about who Jesus is. Because in 2022, we don't have to celebrate Christmas without Christ. As a matter of fact, we should not celebrate Christmas without Christ. And the good news, which is that not what the gospel is that we don't have to. Because we have, in fact, been told. And so Isaiah, he says there is coming a king. What do the gospel writers say? Well, the gospel writers, they tell about the birth of Jesus in part to establish His genuine kingship. In Matthew chapter 2, when the Magi arrived there in Jerusalem, they do not go before Herod and say, "We have come from the east to seek the son of a carpenter." Nope. That is not what they ask. They do not come before Herod and say, "We have come to seek the one who has been born of some of the poorest parents here in the..." No, what do they say? They say, "We have seen his star, and we have come to worship the King of the Jews." That was news to Herod, who fancied himself the King of the Jews. And that is interesting, and I think it is important. But later, after Jesus is arrested, He is brought before the Sanhedrin, and then after that, He is brought before Herod. And what Pilate. Let me get my peoples right this morning. Pilate had been told that Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews. And so he asks him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" In each gospel record, Pilate asks this question. And in each gospel record, Jesus says, "You say it." But in John's gospel, this is John 18, verses 36 and 37, he responds by saying this, "My kingdom is not of this world." And then he says this, folks, don't miss this. "I was born for this." Jesus, as he is standing before Pilate, is thinking about his birth. Why was Jesus born? Well, let's ask him. I was born for this. Born for what? To be a king. To be a king. He is this king that Isaiah prophesies. Finally, this morning, he is a son who identifies as God. I didn't come up with a better way to say that. We live in a culture and a society today full of people who wish to identify themselves. They want to identify according to who they like or who they love or who they think they're supposed to be. So much so that someone born a male will attempt in our day and time to identify as a female, and someone female in our day and time will attempt to identify as male. Now that is a conversation for another day. Because let me tell you about the absurdity of that is that we are living in a day and a time when people who are born human males or human females are now trying to pass themselves up, and I am not making this up, as dogs, as sheep, and as bugs. Let me tell you something. We may look like a fly. We may stink like a dog. We may be a man who might be pretty in a dress or a woman who likes to wear baseball caps, but at the end of the day, we were born, male or female, and we were born human. And it would be absurd for you to identify me in any other terms. And it would be absurd for me to identify you in any other terms. Okay, we've dealt with that. Is that what we're talking about this morning? No. We're asking the question of who this child is going to be. What does it truly mean for a king to come and to bring light into a dark world? What does it mean for a king to come into the world and to be God with us, God for us, and God in us, if not that He is, in fact, God Himself? And you say, Pastor, I have been tracking with you. I have been reading Isaiah for a long time, but there is no verse that says that He is God. Well, that's because we misread the end of verse 6 over and over and over. We look at these titles for the one who will come. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Folks, there are 4 of them. They hang together and they mean something. The phrase Wonderful Counselor is perhaps the greatest affirmation and identification of this coming king as deity, in that it usually describes the supernatural work of the Lord. It literally means a wonder of a person. We have to ask the question, what makes this counselor wonderful? And the answer is the power of miracles that will come with this person. Mary, did you know? Yes, she did know, but perhaps she didn't know that in this little manger was a baby who was going to heal the sick. He was going to walk on water. He was going to feed the crowds. He was going to raise the dead, and indeed Himself He would raise from the dead. He is the mighty God. This phrase here might make us think that He will be a God-like hero. Folks, no, we cannot have that nonsense. In chapter 10, verse 21, Isaiah affirms that this person who is coming is a God, is our God, who is the hero of the story. He is the hero that is going to come, and He will be God. He is an eternal Father, a Prince of Peace. Time escapes me this morning to say everything that needs to be said, but consider the hopelessness of Isaiah's day. We've talked about it, and part of that hopelessness was the moral degradation of even the family. Brothers were betraying brothers. There was no hope. There was no future. And people could not be trusted. They could not trust their leaders. They could not trust their kings. And yet this one who will come, he will be a prince. He will be a leader, but he will be one of peace. There's perhaps more that needs to be said there, but don't miss this. It says He will be an eternal fixture for their care and for their good. That's what it means for Jesus to be an eternal Father. I know sometimes it's confusing, especially when we think about the Trinity, that there's a God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But don't miss this. Sometimes Jesus Himself is said to be like a father. And I think this is what Isaiah is saying here, that Jesus is like a father. And that's good news, especially to the fatherless, but in a spiritual sense, we all understand that we need a permanent fixture for the good of our souls. That's part of what is wrong in this world today, as more and more of the very worldview foundations are being torn away in 2022. People who have lost their family, they are beginning to lose their sense of right and wrong, and they're beginning to lose their grasp on reality because of the culture that we live in today. The good news of the gospel is that not only is God real, but He is a permanent, as I said, and I'll say it again, a permanent fixture in our minds, in our hearts, in our lives. If we will come by faith to His Son Jesus, He is someone who will never leave us nor forsake us this morning.